I'd like to open the discussion with Shireen. I was wondering if you could give us kind of a brief history about your book and why you decided to write about it.
So I just want to start by asking the audience a question. Everyone here a question. How many people have been to Cairo? How many of you have visited the Citadel? The Citadel is a fortress. It's an impregnable fortress. And I use it as a metaphor for sexual life in the Arab region. So the only socially accepted context for sexual activity is marriage. And of course, we're talking about heterosexual marriage. But it's not any old marriage. It's marriage that has to be approved by your family. It has to be approved by religion. And it has to be registered with the state. And anything outside of that is haram, forbidden, it's aib, it's shameful. We have this endless lexicon of reproof. And around this citadel, this impregnable fortress, we have this vast terrain of taboo around homosexuality, around premarital sex, abortion, you name it. And the taboo is reinforced by religion, it's buttressed by family control, and it's reflected in the law. Millions of people are having sex outside the citadel. And these include men and women who have sex with their own sex, or who have a different gender identity. Women who don't fit gender expectations, who are perhaps more educated, have gone on to get jobs, can't find a husband, don't want to get married. If they are having sex outside of marriage, they are also in this sort of forbidden territory. We also have sex workers, we have divorcees, for example. And the challenge for us is how are they going to realize what is a fundamental part of our humanity, the right to have a safe and pleasurable sexual life free of discrimination, violence, or coercion. Now, a gynecologist in Egypt really summed this up for me very nicely. He said, you know what, Shireen? In our part of the world, sex is the opposite of sport. Football, everybody talks about it, but hardly anyone plays it. But sex, everybody's doing it, but hardly anyone wants to talk about it. The reality, of course, is that people talk about sex all the time in our communities. The difficulty we have is taking this discourse into the public domain, whether it's media censorship, for instance, or the lack of sexuality education in schools. There is this veil of silence.
There was a survey conducted which said that 50% of British Muslims think homosexuality should be illegal. People will turn around and tell you, you know, I'm okay with homosexuals, but it's against my religion. How do you feel when people say that?
I mean, I have conversations with Muslims left, right, and centre through social media, through face-to-face, in my own family, in my extended family community, etc., etc. But the majority of them actually are absolutely fine about it. And this idea that it's against my religion does come into play if they were allowed to just say that they were supportive of LGBT Muslims. Then that would be fine. It's just that they don't feel they can comfortably, outwardly say that in today's society.
It's true that 52%, according to this poll, said that homosexuality should be banned, and 48% didn't say it should be banned. They weren't approving of homosexuality. They weren't saying it's fine at all. They were just simply saying that they didn't agree with banning. Now, if I can extract it from the Muslim issue, my mother is a Christian fundamentalist. She believes that according to the Bible, homosexuality is wrong. She thinks it's a sin, but in terms of the hierarchy of sins, a pretty minor one if it's between consenting adults. But also, she thinks that discrimination and prejudice against LGBT people is an even worse sin. And so therefore she supports the principle of legal equality. I think if we look at the trajectory of where the Muslim community has come from and is going to, I see progress in the right direction.
A few years ago, Muslims would have said that it's actually wrong to be gay, that being gay in and of itself as a thing is haram. Now the discourse has somewhat shifted in the right direction, and now people say, well, actually, it's okay for you to be gay. You're naturally gay, you can't help it. But it's wrong, the act is wrong. Now, obviously, that's still bad. That's not where we want to be, but it's progress.
If you're born gay, then what does actually banning or making it illegal mean? Because if what it actually means, in my view of the world, is that banning it means, well, it means you shouldn't exist as a person. And I represent Nazamat Foundation, and the reason why I'm here is because my fiancé, who I met 15 years ago, and we ran away to London to find freedom. And the thing is, if the very point of banning means that my fiancé killed himself, he ended his own life because banning and being against the law was something maybe in his mind on that moment in time, then surely what does banning and making it illegal mean? Because does that mean you have to exclude yourself and take yourself out of being alive?
The one thing we know about surveys is that people lie.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's something called social desirability. People will tell you what they think they should be saying. And so the best way to get at these sort of questions is not to do, knock on someone's door or telephone them, but to engage in one-on-one discussion. And I think we need to be very careful about which Muslim populations you're speaking about. I think in Western democracies, you are seeing possibly a move in the right direction. I think if one looks at Muslim populations elsewhere in the Islamic world, quite frankly, there is a move in the opposite direction in much the Islamic world. There has been a rise of Islamic fundamentalism over the past couple of decades, and it's really interesting that it focuses on sexuality as this sort of fracture line between East and West. So we, the good Easterners and the good Muslims, we don't do this stuff. This stuff comes from the West, therefore we must reject it. 1,000 years ago, these roles were completely reversed. I can tell you that medieval Christian commentators, when they looked at Islam, one of their major criticisms of this upstart faith was, how can the Prophet Muhammad possibly be a messenger of God? This man is so sexed up. And the reason for that is that we spoke very frankly about all shades of sexuality. Haram, halal, didn't really matter. It was there in the literature. Many of these books were written by religious scholars, and we have lost that frankness.
They said that 52% said think gays should be illegal. But, when you look at the demographics of where the communities that they went into, they came from areas such as Bradford, which has a high density, a high population of Muslim community. They went to Leicester. It's a snapshot of certain viewpoints.
Absolutely.
And when we go talk about the Quran and what Muslims really say, when I came out 25 years ago, and I was trying to come to terms with my sexual orientation, I read the Quran and the Bible, and throughout the whole stories, as it were, I was trying to think, what does it say about homosexuality? Specifically about homosexuality is a sin. I could not read anything. When I'm talking to other Muslims and they say it's a sin, or they might say, I accept you, but, that's whatever floats your boat. Yeah. That's fine as well. But I kept saying, okay, have you read the Quran? Yeah. What language are you reading it in? Are you reading it in Arabic or are you reading it in English? Oh, I read it in Arabic. Okay. Do you understand it? No. So how do you know homosexuality is a sin? Because my mom told me. Yeah. My community leader told me. Oh, okay. Absolutely. So you're listening to Chinese whispers.
As a child growing up in Iran, studying Arabic is mandatory. Praying is mandatory. They force you to pray in school. But this leads nicely into my next question for Sahel. What does the Quran actually say about bumming? And do you need an advanced degree in Arabic to interpret it the way it should be?
Actually, you might laugh at him saying, what does the Quran say about bumming? It actually does specifically refer to anal sex. Actually, the word homosexuality in the Quran isn't mentioned. In fact, the Islamic jurists had to invent a term, luti. We now know that homosexuality and other sexualities are natural, that they're unchangeable. Psychiatrists agree. We've tried to change sexuality here in this country even. It failed. Now, with that knowledge, we can then kind of look at the story of Lut. And the story of Lut talks about men who had sex with men. If you look at the context in which that is mentioned, the men who were having sex with men, they were also kind of committing violent acts. And if you place the act of sex with men having sex with men within the context of violence, that gives you rape, men raping men. Now, according to the traditional understanding of the story, the people of Lut were punished because they were gay and they were committing gay acts. Now, the jurist Ibn Hazm, the classical jurist, actually said that the people of Lut were not punished because they were gay. They were punished because they rejected the prophethood of Lut and they rejected God. Now, this is a classical jurist, like hundreds of years ago, who actually came up with this. He disagreed with the other kind of, the majority kind of consensus. And LGBT reformers and reformist thinkers can actually, they build upon that understanding that Ibn Hazm had and build from there.
And what about the hadith?
This is one of the all-time favorites that's top of the pops when it comes to hadiths to condemn homosexuality. When the male mounts another male, the angels are alarmed and raise a cry to their Lord. The wrath of the Mighty One comes down upon those men, and the curse covers them, and the tempters surround them. The earth asks its Lord for permission to swallow them up, and the divine throne grows heavy upon those who bear it up, etc., etc.
If only my sex was that good. Talk about earth-shattering.
Yeah, the earth really did move there, didn't it? Over to you on your thoughts.
I'm glad that you read that hadith out, because if you look at when it comes to hadith science, studying hadith, there's different kinds of hadith. Now, there's one type of hadith which is known as a mutawatir hadith, which is at the same level of authenticity as the Quran within Islamic science. Now, only a handful of hadith, some scholars say only around 80, are actually mutawatir, and they refer to the basics of belief, the 5 pillars, how to pray, etc. None of the hadith that refer to homosexuality or homosexual acts are mutawatir hadith. In fact, not only are they not mutawatir hadith, they are actually pretty weak. If you look at the chain of narration, the transmission, there are a lot of weak narrators in there. So therefore, you can actually disregard all of those hadith that refer to homosexuality.
There are also some Muslims who reject the hadith.
Yeah.
They say the Quran alone is the word of God. In fact, the Quran itself says, this is Allah's message. It is complete. It requires no interpretation and no addition.
Yeah.
So if you took that interpretation, you would say that the hadiths and all the other stuff is completely irrelevant to true Islam.
And one of the problems we have in Islam is that in the heartlands of Islam, we're working in patriarchal authoritarian systems. I mean, basically dictatorships, more or less. And the religion gets subsumed into the politics. So the Islam becomes what the prevailing political powers want you to believe. And as a consequence of that, when the governments want to clamp down on sexuality and want to make scapegoats of LGBT populations, they will twist and they will turn the religion to this end. So the politics and the religion have always been entwined.
What happens is that gay people are seen as having a Western disease, and when they kind of push the so-called gay agenda, they're kind of pushing a Western agenda.
Matt, I would really appreciate if you could tell us about some of the work that you do with your foundation and some of the experiences that you've had.
What I've done is I've actually gone through the hundreds of stories that have been sent to our foundation. Sometimes they ask for help and sometimes they just want to be heard. And I've just summarised just a couple of stories from around the UK. This young gentleman, because of his family's view of the faith that they all follow, he's had to change countries, he's changed names. He's run away from the very family that gave birth to him. The family used solicitors to argue, because he was homosexual, that he was no longer sane in mind, and therefore the solicitors were out to try and seize all assets and financial savings from the individual because he was gay, and they argued because he was gay he was therefore not sane. Another story, the family follow him when he's out of the family home. They go through his personal belongings, they read his text messages. He's been physically hit, he's been verbally abused.
My parents said, well, you're possessed, that's why you're gay. Well, actually, they didn't agree that I was gay. They said that there was no sign with you since you were a kid. Basically, I didn't play with Barbie dolls and stuff. They sent me to an exorcist. After that, my parents exorcised me themselves at home, and, you know, it was extremely distressing. And I became extremely suicidal. And, you know, I even attempted to take my life, and my dad kind of stopped me in, like, halfway through. And that's when I decided I had to leave home.
My eldest sister, we were so close, she took me to one side and she said, perhaps you could marry. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, you could marry and, you know, whatever you do behind the scenes, that'll be left to you. And I said, well, that's unfair, not only on the wife, but, you know, what if I can't function and I can't give you grandchildren? And she said, well, we can find ways and means to adopt and foster. My brother, on the other hand, he physically assaulted me. My other brother took me again to one side. He queried my sexual activities. What did I do in the bedroom? How often, etc., etc. Something has to be done in order to move it forward. It's not just about religion. It's about culture. It's about communities. It's about individuals moving with the times.
There are people in the Muslim community who do embrace their LGBT sons and daughters, uncles, aunts, whatever. And I'd like to pay tribute tonight to Adnan Ali, who founded the first LGBT Muslim organization in this country, Al-Fatiha, in the 1990s. A real pioneer, a real trailblazer. He stuck his neck out at a time when it was so difficult. He was almost a lone voice. So there are positive stories. But on the negative side, a few years ago, I had a tearful Muslim woman phone me to tell her story of how her brother was discovered to be gay. He was tricked into going back to Pakistan, and he was hacked to death with machetes in the back garden of the family. Now, she wanted to go to the police, but she was terrified they'd kill her too if she dared dishonor the family and, implicate the family in the murder. So these are real, grave human rights abuses. And what I find so distressing is most LGBT organizations will not touch this issue. They're afraid of being labeled racist or anti-Muslim, and therefore they just look the other way when LGBTI Muslims are some of the most persecuted, vilified and suffering of our entire community, yet most LGBT organizations will not address the issue. I think that's really shameful.
Absolutely. I was very close with my mother, and it really surprised me that she was the one, and she's very hippie-ish and smokes weed, and she said, "No one will marry your sister. Why are you doing this?" And my father, with whom I had a very patchy relationship, actually turned around and said, "I love you, you're still my son." And behind my back, he actually found a support group for parents of LGBTs. And this is why the work that you do is so important, Matt, because my father benefited from that hugely. Why aren't there more visible gay Muslims in media campaigning and standing up for rights? And even just Muslims who are supportive of LGBT communities.
It's honor culture.
It is.
You lose your honor and you lose your status, and everything falls apart.
But it's not just your honor, it's the collective honors. I mean, that's the big problem about us being able to exercise any sort of sexual rights, whether you're lesbian, gay, transsexual, or you're just a single woman who wants to have sex outside of marriage. Because how can you have sexual rights when you don't even have individual rights?
There's another layer of complexity, I think, to your experience. Being gender fluid, are you more accepted within the Muslim community as a Sifa rather than a Sif, the practicing homosexual man who's out to get their men?
No, to be honest, I don't think I'm accepted for both, to be honest. I think my coming out story has been widely publicised, and I'm glad actually more and more people are talking more about coming out as LGBT Muslims now. When I came out, I was a Sif. I hadn't started drag at that point in my life. I was actually taken to my GP, first of all. And Dr. Singh and Dr. Patel couldn't prescribe anything at all. And they actually stuck up for me. These were South Asian doctors in their 60s that actually stuck up for me and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Qureshi, there's nothing that we can, prescribe for Asif." And then I was taken to my mum. And then, as you say, celibacy, marriage. I entered a 6-month engagement with my first cousin in Pakistan. And I woke up one day and decided, nope, I'm gay. I can't go ahead with that. I'm glad I did that. For me, just being a Sifa has just allowed it really to just take the issue and take it out there into the media and take it out there it's just allowed me to be fully self-expressed around the issue. What my imam agreed to, when he got that I couldn't sexually commit to another woman, that I couldn't abstain, the way he got it right for himself was, okay, enter into a civil partnership. That was the only thing that was available then. And commit yourself to just one person. So it wasn't really, for him, in the end, it wasn't even about same-sex activity. It was about monogamy more than anything else. Yeah. And the other thing that he said was, don't promote it. Don't talk about it. Yeah. And that obviously went out the window.
Here we are.
So, and I still firmly believe that that's probably what it comes down to even today, is these things should not be talked about because they're haram, or, it's essentially about sex itself, actually talking about sex.
Yeah. Now, when somebody who identifies or they're coming to terms with being LGBT, we don't talk about how it impacts an individual through their mental health, how it creates anxieties, depression, low self-esteem, confidence, etc., etc.
There's so many stories and hadiths of people of the Prophet's time actually going to the Prophet and talking about all sorts of health issues relating to health.
What's very interesting, if you look particularly in the Arab region, at the long history of Arabic erotica, which basically went from about the 8th century to the 19th century and started to close down when the Europeans moved in. I'm telling you, there is nothing in the Joy of Sex or YouPorn or, dare I say it, 50 Shades of Grey that they were not covering in Baghdad 1,000 years ago. And we have these fabulous, endless books about homosexual practices, this incredibly sophisticated understanding of trans, in many cases a real appreciation of what they would call a lifestyle.
Yeah.
And that's all been lost.
It's not the penetrator that is homosexual, it's the one being penetrated. Yeah. And essentially the effeminate one.
Yes.
You know.
The shame that
yes,
comes
the
along
shame
with
that comes with that. And I think
the same shame for women, I suppose. Right?
Yes, and I think the boundaries definitely in the Islamic world around gender are so rigid in the sense that, women have to be women, have to do women's role, have to be women, act like women, as do men. Mm-hmm. That sort of plays a part in it.
On that point, I think the Iranian transgender program is very evil and sinister.
Yes.
Its purpose is to eradicate homosexuality.
Yes.
It's to force and pressure LGBT people to become trans or, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people.
And then possibly into sex work.
As a way of eradicating what they see as the problem.
Yeah.
History is written by the winners, and there is no way, if it exists today, it must have existed in the past. It's just they covered it up. That's number one. Number two is that if I want to believe in a God, there is an ayah which says that وَخَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, which means that it's God has created you this way. Mm-hmm. And the third thing, it is a biological thing. It has nothing to do with you are what you are.
What have you seen that's actually worked in the Middle East? What are the initiatives? Like Helm, for example. For me, Helm seems to have worked somewhat.
So Helm is the granddaddy of all LGBT support groups. It started in Lebanon, early 2000s. Tunisia is the other place that we've seen a real flourishing birthplace of the Arab Spring. There are now almost 10 groups, and they tend to appeal to a more sort of middle class and educated group, but they certainly are there, and they're not just online, which is interesting. The classic way that newspapers will describe a homosexual person is shaz, which basically means deviant. Helm and its allies, they've done a fantastic job. They now use the term mithli, which is basically someone who has sex with the same sex. But then if you look at other countries, and I'm going to talk specifically about Egypt, before 2011, we did have a slightly burgeoning LGBT movement, very small groups, completely gone to ground now in this massive government crackdown, particularly on gay men and trans male to female individuals, and largely not because the government gives a toss about what you do in the bedroom, but because they are busy clamping down on the Muslim Brotherhood, and at the same time they need to show their Islamic street cred because Egyptians are conservative, and the easiest way to do that is to lash out at a population that people don't particularly approve of, let's say LGBT. What I can say, however, is that the LGBT activists, they're very, very clear on their aspirations. They are not looking for the freedom to come out. What they really want is the freedom to stay in and do as they choose behind closed doors. And that, interestingly, that element of privacy is a central tenet of Islam.
I was just wondering about gay women in the Muslim community.
Some of the classical jurists thought lesbianism was okay because there's no penetration going on. There's a word for it, is it?
Sohake are women who grind against.
Yeah.
No, I'm not kidding. That's the origin. But you're right. It's completely Clintonian definition of sex. If it doesn't involve a penis and penetration, well, then it's not really sex. It's incredibly difficult as a woman. Your sexuality is so controlled in law and by your family that, although they're not actually, lesbians, or most of our countries are not on the receiving end of laws which tend to be targeted towards sodomy, but it doesn't matter. Their lives are so much more isolated and lonely because men, gay, straight, you can go out, you're a man. But a woman, you have to stay in. So it is very, very difficult situation.
Thank you so much.